or call 1-855-854-6920.
Well, now I want to begin that historical study. I've begun, of course, with the earliest form of philosophy, that is the philosophy of the Garden of Eden, the philosophy that Adam and Eve carried out in their conversations with God. A lot happened after that time. Of course, they fell into sin. And sin affected the mind, okay? Sin led people to repress the truth of God, Romans 1, in unrighteousness. So there are noetic effects of sin. There's the sin affects our thinking, sin affects our philosophizing. And that's why you have this antithesis between Christian ways of thinking and non-Christian ways of thinking. That's why not everybody believes in the Christian worldview. So, but what happens, of course, is that about 600 BC, the philosophy begins in a kind of disciplined way. Now, philosophy has always existed in kind of informal ways. The term philosophy means love of wisdom, doesn't it? And we have books like the Book of Proverbs that gather together the wisdom of the world, both from Israel and from outside Israel, some of the passages in Proverbs. And so all of that teaching develops, people trying to figure out what this world is like, trying to understand life, trying to understand how to live in a practical way. And some cultures, of course, have brought their wisdom into religions, where they bow down before idols, where they hold religious rites, where they bring sacrifices, sometimes even human sacrifices. And so and usually most religions claim at least to be a repository of wisdom. In Greece, there was, of course, polytheistic religion with Zeus and Hera and Apollo and Venus and all of those. But there was also, simultaneous with that, there was a view of fate. Fate, if you read any of the Greek tragedies, or if you read Homer and Hesiod, fate is an impersonal reality which is somehow higher than any of the gods, which directs the course of history, and which people are sometimes punished if they try to defy fate. So in Greece you have both personal gods who are non-absolute, and then you have this principle of fate, which is absolute but not personal. It all becomes very, very confusing after a while. In Greek religion, you have this idea of the ever-flowing tide of reality, which moves along, and we find ourselves swept up in it, and we try to understand its course and where it's going. But about 600 BC, there are some people living in a place called Miletus, which is mentioned in the Bible, as a matter of fact, one of the stops of Paul. Miletus, they were called Milesians, who decided we're not going to try to understand the world by reference to these polytheistic gods anymore, because it's so arbitrary. I mean, one thing happens because Zeus is mad at Hera, or Hera's mad at Zeus, or because Zeus comes down to earth and begets a child, and this happens and that happens. It's like a soap opera, and it just doesn't seem to make sense to say, okay, the storm came up because Neptune wanted the storm to come up, and these people fell in love because Venus wanted them to fall in love, and Cupid shot an arrow and hit them at some point. That one didn't seem to be a reliable way of determining what is true and determining the proper direction of history. There must be a better way. And what the Milesians tried to do is to say, we're not going to base our view of the world on religion anymore. We're going to base our worldview on reason, okay? And of course, by reason, they mean autonomous reason. They didn't have a slightest clue about the God who's presented in the Bible. They never mention a being like that. They never give him any consideration at all. For them, reason is just what they are able to think about, what conclusions they are able to reach through their own thinking, through their own reasoning. So, we have among the Milesians, first, this man is often considered to be the first philosopher, Thales. And we don't know very much about Thales. We don't know if he wrote any books. We don't know what he did. But we have a few sayings that are preserved for us by Aristotle and others later on. Thales is supposed to have said, all is water, okay? I think he's also supposed to have said, all things are full of gods, which is interesting view of immanence. And I'm told that Thales is also famous because he predicted an eclipse at some point. But what he's most famous for in the history of philosophy is the statement, all is water. What does that mean, and how did he come to that statement? Well, I don't know. You know, these guys, Thales said all is water, Anaximenes said all is air, Anaximander said all is indefinite. These are not scientists. I mean, they don't have experiments. They don't have a program of experiment and observation where they take 1,000 observations and come to this conclusion and so on and so forth. That's not the way they worked. These were armchair scientists, armchair philosophers, working basically with their own reason and nothing else. And so they ask themselves, here we are living in this world. What is it made of in the final analysis? I mean, you know, if you make a cake, you exchange the recipe with somebody else, and she says, well, what is this made of? You know, what are the ingredients? That's kind of the question that they were asking. What is the world made of? If you get this world chopped down to its very basic elements, its very basic nature, what is the world anyway? They really didn't have a whole lot of choices back then. The Greeks believed that the world was composed of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Okay, and these combined with one another to form trees and leaves and people and clouds and stuff. But there's 4 basic elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And at this early period in the history of philosophy, basically they were in the business of choosing among these 4, choosing the one that seemed to be most fundamental. So Thales chose water. Why did he choose water? Well, you can imagine, I mean, I don't know why, but you can imagine what kind of ideas went through his head. He probably said, well, look at all the water that there is. I mean, we're living next to the Mediterranean Sea. Look at all that water out there. And water comes down from the sky, too. And people dig wells, and there's water coming up from the ground. And there are rivers and there are lakes. And think of how much we need water. I mean, we can't live very long without drinking water. So a lot of our bodies must be made out of water, right? And so Thales must have reasoned water as the most fundamental element. Everything else is kind of a variation of water. Everything else is basically water. Then there's Anaximander comes along, another Milesian philosopher, and he says, no, it's probably not earth, air, fire, or water. It's probably, a fifth thing, something else that transcends all of them. Maybe, there's something that's below, that's fundamental to these other four. So he calls that the indefinite, or the apeiron, the infinite, it's sometimes translated. And then there's Anaximenes, and Anaximenes says, well, look, really, I mean, there's more air than there is water, isn't there? You look at it, there's air all over the place, and we can live without water for a little while, but we can't live without air more than a few minutes. So you can imagine them getting into battles about which of the four elements was fundamental. What can we make out of this? And I'm always going to be treating these philosophers as part of a spiritual battle, part of the spiritual warfare that is also an intellectual warfare. And what's going on here? Well, we find in these Milesian Greek philosophers, the earliest philosophers, see, this goes back to the very beginning, we find among them what I've called rationalism and what I've called irrationalism. Rationalism says the mind is competent apart from God's revelation. You see, God's revelation never enters in here. The human mind is competent autonomously, all right, to determine the most basic fundamental principle of the universe, the ultimate explanation of everything. It's kind of presumptuous, isn't it? I mean, here's Thales sitting in his easy chair, whatever the equivalent of an easy chair was back then, and saying, I am competent to tell what the fundamental essence, the fundamental nature of all things is. And whatever I say it is, it's got to be. And so he says, all is water. And someone else, all is air. Heraclitus said, all is fire. I don't think anybody said all is earth. I guess earth is the least promising because it's the least changeable. It's the least volatile. But all is water. If all is water, there is no creator-creature distinction. Because if all is water and there's a God, then God is water too. Okay? And so God and the world are on the same level. We're all made of the same kind of stuff. All reality is composed of the same stuff. So we are divine and God is water. God is water, we are God, God is us. Well, that's what happens with rationalism. Your mind is a divine mind because you're able to think autonomously. But when you look at it from the other side, this is also irrationalist because not only is man divinized, but God is humanized. God is reduced to water. God is reduced to air. God is reduced to the indefinite. The most basic principle, see, if God exists, then God is the most basic principle. The most basic principle, the most basic thing in the world is mindless and purposeless. So there really isn't any meaningfulness to the world. There really is no intelligible structure to the world. But at the same time, on this basis, human thought is reduced to water. Human thought is reduced to air. Human thought is reduced to fire. Human thought is reduced to the indefinite. Human thought becomes the chance developments of an impersonal cosmic process. Van Til kind of satirized this by saying it's human beings trying to get to know reality is like a man who's made out of, and you know, keep Thales in mind when you hear this metaphor. It's like a man who's made out of water trying to climb out of the water with a ladder of water. See, he's trying to gain some knowledge of the world, trying to transcend, trying to get a transcendent view of things. But since he is water and his mind is water and everything else is water, he's in a hopeless condition of trying to climb out of water on a ladder of water when he himself is made out of water. The mind is water. And what happens with that? Well, if you reduce the mind to some material thing, what does that do to the mind? Water has different properties from the properties we usually ascribe to the mind. The mind thinks. The mind has ideas that are true or false. The mind constructs valid logical arguments or invalid logical arguments. But water is very different. Water is cold or hot. Water is flows fast or slow. Water is stagnant or free-flowing. Water is good to drink or bad to drink. These are totally different. I mean, the human mind is not bad to drink or good to drink. The human mind is not fast-flowing or stagnant. And water is not true or false. Water is not intelligent or unintelligent. So if you try to push these together, if you try to make them the same thing, then you really reduce the mind to non-thinking substance. And you have rationalism and irrationalism. See, this is what happens when you look at the world from a non-Christian point of view, when you look at the world without God. On the one hand, you lose your basis for saying anything truly, and so you become an irrationalist. On the one hand, you try to do everything, think on your own authority, and you become a rationalist. And you can't really avoid either one of these. You get them at the same time. But how can you do that? I mean, rationalism and irrationalism would seem to be contradictory to one another. So how can you hold those two things together? But that's what happens when you try to think without God. When you get rid of God, you are an irrationalist or a rationalist or both. And when your rationalism gets you into trouble, let's say here you are, you're thinking like Thales does, and you see there's a problem. I mean, my mind is becoming water. What can I say about that? Then you jump up here and you say, well, I just don't know. You say, my mind is not adequate to think properly about this. Or if you start off as an irrationalist, and you say, well, nobody can know anything for sure. And then somebody says, well, how do you know that? And you say, I know that on the authority of my own autonomous mind. So you start off with irrationalism and you become rationalistic. Or you start with rationalism and you become irrationalistic. And these are really quite inseparable. I mean, they would seem to be contradictory, but you can't get rid of the one, well, once you've committed yourself to the other. And we've seen an example of that among the Milesians.